Welcome to the Visual Studies 178, third TUT on your framing the photographic. So this week's reading we'll be looking at Frank Moller's The Looking Not Looking Dilemma. And whenever we approach a reading, we have to first ask ourselves the question as to what the title tells us about that reading already. So what can the title of the reading already tell us about the text? If we look at the wording used in it, so looking not versus not looking, so the title has put the action of the photograph onto the viewer. So it is the viewer which might be placed at the focus of this reading. Then they use the word dilemma, so perhaps there is a question of the morals of viewing images. Last week we approached Raynaud's reading in terms of picturing violence, whereas this week's reading deals more with the idea surrounding the looking of the viewer on images of human suffering. We may be constantly surrounded by images of suffering, but there seems to be a morally defendable position by which we are able to consume these images excessively. This may stem from the images being constantly bombarded into our social life. It may not. Within the first sentence of the reading, we are taken back to the example of the Abu Ghraib photographs that we looked at in the previous TUT in Mark Raynaud's reading. So from this, we already have an understanding of the photographs and the positions proposed by other academics, being Mark Raynaud. When looking at these photographs, Moller looks to Stephen Eisenman, who speaks to a moral blindness of the viewer in the consumption of the Abu Ghraib images. So Eisenman argues that there is no alternative but the passivity by which we view these images, resulting in a passivity on the part of the viewer. So what he's looking at here is the political action by which the viewer can have in terms of the consumption of these images. So what reaction does the viewer have in terms of his moral reaction against these images? So what does the viewer do to prevent these images, or rather a reaction to the images in terms of preventing the suffering in which they depict? Or does the viewer then take on a stance where he would have a reaction against the people creating the suffering, or the people actually taking the photographs? Moller then looks to Eisenman's colleague, Horst Bredekamp, who disagrees with this idea. So Bredekamp states that the deliberate viewing of such images places the viewer in an act of complicity with the crime being committed. By this, we mean that the viewer becomes directly involved with the crime being committed and becomes an accomplice of the perpetrator. So we see the viewer of such images actually becoming the perpetrator, and then this brings us back to previous ideas of victimizing the victim by the viewer. So over the last two tutorials, we have seen how the photographic of suffering can in itself be a driver in the process of suffering. So in the first tutorial, we looked at Solomon Godot's concept of a double act of subjugation, and in the second tutorial, we looked at Raynaud's concept of a re-victimization, in which the camera was also seen to be used as a torture device to create a suffering of its victims or subject. So we see the photographic as a way to actually produce violence, with the camera as a way to bring the viewer closer to the act of violence. So there is a relationship formed between the viewing of the images and a participation in the act of violence itself. So we see the viewer actually participating in the act of violence through their viewing of the images. So if we take these two arguments of Eisenman and Bredekamp, we can say that they simply state that if we have no choice in our consumption of such images, then we have no choice in our involvement of the suffering as the viewer. So this results in debates surrounding visual representation, addressing critical questions of responsibility and involvement when taking, publishing, circulating, and viewing images of human suffering. We must then also look to the photographer in terms of how the reason behind why the photographer takes the photographs in the way they do. So if we look back to the Abu Ghraib photographs, we can see how the photographs clearly indicate that they were not meant for a public viewing, but rather were taken merely for the people that had done the photographs themselves. Critics often seem to assess photographs in relation to what they ought to be able to deliver, not in relation to what they actually can deliver. So we can say that photographs do not decriminalize the suffering they depict. However, there must be a form of power in the viewing of such images. So not looking would place the viewer outside of a position to have any form of power or influence on the repercussions of such images. So once again here we see the reading bring back the focus on the viewer as opposed to the focus on the images themselves or the people that are taking these images. The problem lies in the subject position of the viewer in the viewing of images of human suffering. So here once more we look to the aestheticization of the photographic, much like we have done in the last two tutorials. So the formal structure is considered above all in a culturally conditioned understanding of beauty and offer a disinterested pleasure to the viewer. This disinterest forms part of the abstraction of the conditions of suffering pictured through the aestheticization and obscure the meaning and implications of the events of suffering depicted. So what we are looking at here is a lack of critical engagement by the viewer. When we look at anti-aesthetics in terms of the photographic, we still see an aestheticization by the choice to not aestheticize. We can also then look to non-aestheticized images. But what can be said is that the aestheticization of images of suffering stimulate a sympathy and empathy on the part of the viewer. So we can see how the viewing of the images enacts an emotional reaction to what is being depicted. So thus we can say that non-aestheticized images would not cope better in their reach to influence the viewer to a political reaction. Moller then looks to Jenny Edkins, who argues that each photograph of suffering commands from the viewer a response, and yet no response is adequate for the situation. Yet the viewer is from the actual event of suffering by time and geography, and so has no means of an immediate effect on behalf of the suffering other than the emotional response to the depiction of the suffering. So the helplessness and horror of bearing witness to suffering brings with it the demand for a response, and yet one's response to photographs can do nothing to alleviate the suffering depicted. In this lack of a correct response, we see the victimizing of the viewer. So the viewer is in some way created as a victim to the bombardment of images of suffering without the correctness of response. But when we look at photographs of human suffering, we see an identification on behalf of the victim by the viewer of a human. So this elevates the victim through the commodities of human subjectivity. So the question of to look or not to look at such images, both options seem to result in the same dilemma. The viewer has to respond but cannot. Looking exposes him or her to unsolvable moral dilemmas, but not looking does neither answer the core question of how to respond adequately, nor would it seem to be morally acceptable position towards the pain and suffering of others. Moller looks to Alfredo Jarre's The Rwanda Project from 1994 to 2000 to demonstrate a way in which the artist and the audience can avoid the looking-not-looking dilemma. So Jarre's project tries to make the audience aware of their own responsibility without putting other people's suffering on display. Within Jarre's installation piece, The Eyes of Gutete Emerita, the viewer is confronted not with horrific photographs of the Rwandan Tutsi genocide, but with the eyes of a woman who has suffered a great loss in the genocide. As you have read in the reading, there was an exhibition of this installation where the viewer was confronted with these photographs of eyes and also mirrors. Within this instance, there is a disintegrating of the distance between the viewer and the eyes. Thus, the viewer is not looking at horrific photographs of dead bodies in Rwanda, but they are forced to think of themselves as if they were in Gutete Emeriti's shoes, implicating the audience. Jar's work forces the audience to confront the uncomfortable reality of the genocide by refusing to show the results thereof through photojournalistic photographs of the terrors. Jar's text and photographs allude to scenes of a horrific nature, but Jar does not involve the viewer in the act of a crime against the victim, but rather draws the viewer's attention to the suffering, thus sidestepping the looking not looking dilemma.